Okay, welcome to the third training session. We're going to take a look at managing website DNS with SiteGlide today. So we'll just have a quick look at what's coming up so that you know what you're getting yourselves into. First of all, we'll take a look at an introduction to DNS. So it will be more of a basic introduction about how you can think about DNS, how you might be able to explain it to your clients, along with a bit of a diagram there as well. We'll then take a look at some DNS records, so the common record types and explanations of sort of what they are, why you might use them. We'll then come on to, so there are two methods of adding domains to SiteGlide, as I'm sure you guys know. The first being external, where you manage it in the registrar, and the second being fully delegated, where you manage it in SiteGlide. We'll take a look at both of those. We'll take a look at the registrar as well, so you can see both sides on how to set them up and what's involved in that flow. And then we'll come on to FAQs and questions. So in the FAQs, we'll take a look at a bunch of tips, workarounds, any eccentricities of AWS that you might need to be aware of so that you are really confident when managing DNS for your clients and can trust that you can deal with anything that comes up. And then, yeah, we'll take a look at the submitted questions as well and go through those. So first of all, an introduction to DNS. So for those of you who do know already how DNS works, bear with me. This is a very simple diagram to illustrate the point. It is not an exhaustive diagram about how DNS works. So the first step being, the first step in a flow is where a user is in the browser and they search to find your site. And what we're going to do is we're going to think about DNS as a postal service. And they need to know where you live, especially if you're moving sites. So if you move a site to SiteGlide, you need to update DNS to let everybody know where your new address is. So when a site is searched for in a browser, it will go off and it will find the registrar, which we can think of as a bit of an address book. And the registrar tells the browser where to look to find out the address for the website. So in this example, those would be DNS records. So if the registrar server has found it and returns a positive, they'll then find a return response address. And that usually is in the form of an IP address. It's just you don't see that. And then that gets returned to the device for the users. So there's quite a bit involved when you search for a site, but overall you can think of it in those basic terms. It's just an address book. It's finding out where the site lives and then getting the address so that you don't need to remember it. It makes it easier for us to read as well, because then we don't need to remember loads of different IP addresses. We just need to remember the nice names that we use in marketing. So next is DNS records. So we'll take a look at the types and explanations of those as well, and when you might use them. So types of DNS records, we're going to go through the key ones that we would use in relation to our platform. There are other DNS record types available, but they're not used as often, so we'll ignore those for now. The first is NS, so name server records. So these are probably one of the ones that are most familiar for you guys, and they define effectively which server is the authority for the domain. So as we looked at in the diagram just there, that tells the browser and the registrar and the servers where to look to find the address for the domain. So typically you get 4 of those. We'll come on to that a bit later as well. I'll do a bit of an explanation comparison on those. Then next is CNAME, so the canonical name record. So this is most commonly used to set up subdomains. So for example, we have help.siteglide.com. And many of you use that for client sites as well. It can also be used in lieu of A records, which I'm also going to come on to and show an example of later on. Next is A records. So this is probably the other most common one that you're all familiar with, and these are just static IP addresses, and that tells the servers where specifically to go to get a return of information. The next is text records. So these are primarily used for long strings. So text records are strings of text and characters. originally, way back when, they were actually just designed as notes for DNS, so they didn't really have a purpose. But nowadays, yeah, as you can see, the most common use would be something like, DKIM records, so security records for email or other services for verification. So next is MX, so mail exchange. So as described, these are commonly used for turning on mail servers for custom domains. So if any of you are using a vanity domain in your email, you will most likely have an MX record set up in the DNS as well to turn that on. And then we have service records. So these define specific hosting port for services such as VoIP. So many of us nowadays use online calling services rather than static numbers on phone lines, and also instant messaging for larger companies. This all runs off the service records as security backup. Next, we have sender policy. So the sender policy framework effectively authorizes a server to send mail. You don't need it to send mail. So, for example, many of the sites on SiteGlide may not have one of these set up already because it's a manual setup. The emails still send, but can sometimes over time get flagged by different mailing lists and so on, and be flagged and blocked or marked as spam. So for reducing spam, but also security of knowing who is sending the email, it's a good idea to have an SPF record set up, and that just authorizes it. It says, yes, we are the ones actually sending this email. And finally, the PTL record. Now, this is a less commonly known one. It's more useful for much larger clients. If they're very large companies, they'll have specific requirements for managing their network incoming and outgoing. So we'll take a look at this shortly, but actually this is pretty much it's a reverse lookup. So the IP address, so a little bit like an A record, would be in the opposite order, and then you have some syntax on the end. So less common, but usually for sort of enterprise level or large clients. So on SiteGlide, we have two methods of adding DNS. The first is fully delegated, where you add the domain to SiteGlide and then you manage it all from SiteGlide as well. And the second is external, where you add the domain, but you continue managing it in the registrar. We're going to take a look at both of these today, and I'm going to show you a demo of both methods. First, we're going to start with the external domain. So adding an external domain to SiteGlide, and we're going to take a look at both sides. So also the SiteGlide side and also the registrar. So I'm going to just jump out of this here. So I have a test site set up that allows me to add domains. So the first thing you're going to want to do is head over to Site Settings, the Domains tab, and then you can add a new domain from here. We'll pick the external. I'm actually, for demo purposes, going to use a different domain at the moment, but I'm just going to type in something like this, and we're just going to click Add to add that domain. So this takes a minute. It will go off and it will process the application of the domain. It will start applying it to the site and preparing things like the SSL records and any other space required for you to manage it. Typically, this will just take a minute or two. If it's a particularly busy day, it might take a few minutes longer. But usually after another sort of 30 seconds or so, we'll be able to refresh this and see the first step. Obviously, you can see here we've got this status creating, so it's pretty clear whether or not the domain is ready to be used. So I think what we'll do is we'll just give it a refresh and see if it's ready for us to carry on. Okay, so we can see the status is now changed to ownership verification pending. So if we click into the domain, we can see we're on step 1 of 2. So this is the SSL step. So it's to verify that you do own the domain, and it will allow the SSL certificate to be applied to the domain that you've added to the SiteGlide site. So as promised, what you would do with these is go and add them in your registrar. So we'll take a look at that now. I'm going to copy the name just for speed. So we'll copy that and then head over to the registrar. Oops. Okay. So we've got a list of records here. I'm already in a domain on our registrar, so we are with GoDaddy here. So I'll head in and I'll go, right, I want to add a CNAME, just following the instructions. We're going to paste in that name value, and we'll also paste in the other value here. So we'll copy this and paste it in. Time to live, typically you'd want to just pick the shortest option. Some allow completely custom, but for the most part, you'll just pick the shortest, and then you can click add to add the record in. So as you saw, it probably take about half an hour to add that. Registrars typically, as you see here, cover themselves and say up to 48 hours for any DNS changes, but as many of you will know, it's usually within a few minutes. So that's the first step. The second step I've actually already set up. So let's head in and take a look. So if we go into here, we can see I've already added this earlier for speed. So I added the SSL step here. So once that's completed and we've waited half an hour or so for the registrar to update, you can come back and you'll see the second step. Now this step is adding a CNAME record, and this operates based on load balancers. So earlier when I mentioned, I was talking about the A records, so the fact that they're static IPs, and I mentioned about CNAMEs and they can be used in lieu of A records. This is one example of that, which I'll explain a bit more later on why it's set up this way. But all you'll need to do is come into your registrar and again, set up the instructions. So a CNAME for the WW, and we're going to copy this value. So we'll come in here, add another record for a CNAME, www in the name, and then paste in the value, the shortest time to live as well. And then we can add that in. The final step to make sure that your site goes live, there are two options for this, and it completely depends on the registrar, which registrar you're with, and what they allow you to do. So now that the WW is in place, if we went to the domain with the W's on there in the URL, so for example, siteglide.info. If we hit enter on this after it propagated, it would load the site. However, if we just left it like that, when we remove the W's, it wouldn't resolve to anything. It would get stuck and present an error. To resolve that, you can either, depending on the registrar, you can either come in and add another CNAME, and rather than having W's in there, just leave it with the root. So it's either an @ symbol for some registrars, or you'd leave the name field blank and you'd paste in that same value. So that would just mean that both the WW and the CNAME and the root domain are both going to resolve and show the website for you. So this is one method. As it happens, GoDaddy is one of the registrars that doesn't allow a root CNAME record. So instead of doing this, we'll clear that. What you would do is, and again, if you're not sure how to, you can talk to the support team for your registrar. You'd want to set up domain forwarding. So I've actually already set this up, but let me delete this and I'll show you the steps in GoDaddy here. Each registrar is going to have their own UI. So if you get stuck, you can always ask them for help, as I said. So we want to set up domain forwarding, and we want it to be secure, not HTTP. So HTTP, while it's doing the forwarding, will open a gateway for either hackers or anybody to intercept the data. Which is not a good idea. So you should absolutely be looking for secure forwarding from your registrar. Most registrars offer this. And what we'll do is secure, and then the destination URL. So this is going from the root, and we want to go to the W's. So we'll do siteglide.info like this. And we want it permanent because we're going to keep the site for a while, and then we can hit save. And that's it, we're done. So after everything's finished propagating, your site will then be live, and any records that you have in your registrar will continue to work. If you want to add or amend records, you'd come to the registrar and it's all managed here, but your SiteGlide site will be live to the world. Okay, so the next method is the fully delegated method. So we're going to take a look at this one as well. And I'll do a demo here. So we'll head over to SiteGlide first. And what we're going to do is I'll just back out of this. I'm going to delete the domain and I'll re-add it for demonstration purposes as a fully delegated domain. And then I'll also take a look at some of the record types that you, record type examples of adding records to the domain so that you can see how you can start managing those. So let's delete those, and I'm going to re-add the domain using the fully delegated option in SiteGuide, like this. For both options, you'll have noticed we have the default domain down here. Now, this, if you choose to turn it on, it doesn't do a huge amount unless your developers are using it. So this can be used to provide the vanity URL when calling assets to the page, for example. But if your developers haven't set that up, turning this on won't do anything. So it doesn't do any harm. So you can leave it on or off. It's completely optional. You could also choose to add DNS records right here. For demo purposes, I think I'm just going to remove that, turn that off, and I'm going to add the domain as it is for now and let it create the hosted zone for us. Okay, so the domain's been added now, and if we click into it, you'll see the DNS records have not yet been generated because we've only just added it. So at the moment, the system is trying to process it, and it will generate the DNS records for us in a minute or two. From here, you'll be able to manage and add any DNS records. Now, if you're switching from another platform, or if you're switching from managing it externally in a registrar, I would highly recommend adding any existing records first, and then come on to switch the DNS records. So that way it will minimize any downtime of email services and things like that for the client. So in here, we can add in new records, and we have various types. These are the types that we went through earlier in the presentation. So now I think what we'll do is we'll just go back and we'll circle back to the presentation here. Okay, so as promised, we're going to take a look at some record examples. So the first is CNAME. Now, this is typically just like a domain name or other along those lines. Then we have the A record, which is a static IP. You'll all be familiar with that. Text records, they're just strings. So you'll copy in, they'll often be generated by the service that you're using, and you can just paste them in. We will look at some exceptions shortly to help you cover any outliers. MX records, so with Amazon, any SiteGuide site at the moment is hosted on AWS, as you all know. They handle the priority and wait fields and things slightly differently. So some services and registrars may have separate fields for each individual piece of information here. AWS puts it all in one. So if you were to add an MX record, you include the priority with a space and then the mail server name after that in the same field. The same goes for the SRV record, so they don't have separate fields. You put one after the other with a space in between here to meet the criteria. Then we have the SPF record. Again, that will be just generated by a service for you. You can go ahead and paste that in. And the PTR, if anybody wants to use that or needs to with a larger client, as you can see, and I mentioned earlier, it's an IP address in reverse order, followed by some syntax. So IP6 is the latest, but there are a few variations to this. Again, the larger company will discuss it with you, and they'll tell you what you need. So you don't need to work out that on your own. Okay, so before we come on to that, I'm actually going to, whoops, sorry. What's going on? There we go. Before we come on to FAQs and some workarounds, what I'm going to do is just quickly head back into the registrar just to cover this in case anybody doesn't know. So the other half of adding a fully delegated domain would be the DNS records. So if we refresh the page here, we'll now be able to see the DNS records that have been generated. There we go. And we'll want to go ahead and add these to our registrar. So this is a GoDaddy example. Each registrar is different, and if you need a hand on where to add them or how to do that, you can reach out to the support of your chosen registrar. So in GoDaddy, it's just below the DNS records. So we'll click change, and I want to enter my own. And then all we would need to do is start copying these in. So we copy in all four. We'll need 4 of those. And then you would click save. I'm not going to do this now because I want to keep this domain registered with this registrar. But all you would do is click save, and just like adding any other records, within about half an hour usually, these changes will process and it will switch over. Be aware that any records you have in your registrar will stop working, they'll be ignored, and the records that you've added to your SiteGlide site will begin being read, which is why it's important to add them first in SiteGlide. Add any other records that you want to keep working, and then switch DNS records. The SSL is automatically applied and generated for you with this approach, unlike the external. So there are no additional records that you need to add for this method. Okay. On to FAQs. So we're going to take a look at some common questions or pitfalls and workarounds to make sure that you can all be confident in managing DNS on SiteGlide and AWS. So first of all, how do we add multiple records with the same name? So on many services, you would add the second record with the same name as the first, and then you have your different values in each. On AWS, you're not allowed to do this. So the workaround is to add one record with that single name, and then in the value field, you add in the first value and then hit enter, so new line, and add this second value. Now, when this propagates and it's read by DNS, this registers as two separate records. It's just how Amazon asks you to format it when entering into their system. Next is, how do we add a record with the name of at, or root is also what that means. Now, all registrars and DNS append the domain name after the name field. It doesn't matter which record you add, that's what happens. So I could write, sub in the name, and it would render as sub.example.com if that was our domain. AWS don't allow the at character. What they do instead is ask you to leave the name field blank. So at just means root, i.e. domain name only, so example.com. So by leaving it blank, it just skips and goes example.com on the root there. So that's how you add a root record. Next is, how do we add a record that has more than 255 characters? Amazon have a character limit on each of their DNS record values. So obviously that's 255 characters. Now, there are some record types. The most common, as you can see, is the DKIM for verifying on email, etc. So those typically are over 400 characters. The way you can get a workaround for this on Amazon is to split the content. So if you look closely, you'll see I've put little red quote marks. So what you would do is paste your content in, you put a quote mark at the beginning, and then halfway through, so you work out where your halfway point is, you put a closing quote, then immediately an open quote, and then put your closing quote at the end. So it splits the content into two, but you don't add a new line in, it's all on one line. And what this does is when it renders, it will render as a complete line of value. I've also been told that it's possible to specify that you'd like a shorter DKIM record from certain services. So if you don't want to head into this workaround, you could also request a shorter version of that. Question 4 is, why do AWS use a CNAME load balancer and not an IP address? So I mentioned this earlier. Most older services will use, to put a site live or any other service, you'd use an A record and you'd have a static IP that tells the internet where to find you. Amazon are not alone. They're probably the biggest person doing it at the moment, but to escape the issue of the fact that IP addresses are running out, there's only a finite amount of number combinations that you can have. And obviously the internet's a very busy place. There are newer versions of IP addresses that are longer, more complex, but ultimately you still reach a limit with those. So one of the workarounds that is being used more and more commonly now is the same one that's Amazon use. is to use a CNAME load balancer. This value is called a load balancer. And what it does is it tells the registrar to go and find, so it'll go and look up the load balancer, which is obviously resolves at Amazon. And then Amazon can dynamically assign an IP address. So that allows them to recycle IP addresses, and it also allows them to manage server load as well. So it has some benefits, but it's a little bit different to perhaps the old school or more traditional way of putting a site live. Next is, why should we use 4 NS records and not just the one? So some people historically might have just used one NS record like this to switch the site and make it live. There are some, I've come across 1 or 2 registrars that are extremely old and haven't been updated, and they don't actually allow more than 2 NS records. Now, in those circumstances, you can put a site live technically with 1 or 2 NS records. But you really want to be, if you can, moving to a registrar that allows for all 4. It improves the reliability. So if one of the servers goes down, it will just switch and use a backup. So if you can use all 4, you have a much less likely chance of having downtime on your site. Whereas if you just have 1 or 2, the risk is obviously therefore 50%, 75% greater if there is an issue. And finally, I believe, is question 5, which is, I've copied a new record into SiteGlide and it isn't working, why not? So this is quite a common one that we see. A lot of services, rather unhelpfully, will provide, when they generate a DNS record for you, they will display it a bit like this. And they say, right, go and copy this into your registrar or wherever you manage your DNS. Now, as I mentioned earlier, DNS always appends the name field with the domain. So this name field then will read as sip tls example.com and then append example.com. So it will try and look for a duplicate of the domain, and that's obviously doesn't exist because that isn't the domain. So the correct way to enter this, if you get a record from another service, would be the name field just having the sip tls in, and it'll automatically append the example.com for you on the end of that name field. Okay, so we're going to touch on some questions that were submitted beforehand, and then we'll open up the floor to you guys live if you have any questions that you'd like to ask as well. So the first question is from Julia, and she asks, do you have any recommendations for the best method of adding additional or alternate domains for SiteGlide sites? So it depends what you're trying to do. Some clients buy multiple domains just because they want some coverage of that, maybe location coverage, etc. It's not a great idea for SEO to have multiple domains with exactly the same content. So in that case, I'd recommend adding 1 domain to SiteGlide, to your SiteGlide site, and then using the domain forwarding that we looked at earlier in the registrar to forward the other domains to that core domain that you've added. So that will keep your SEO scores good, and it means that you could still advertise those other domains if you wanted to for whatever reason. If you're perhaps wanting to add like a subdomain area in, etc., you can of course add multiple domains to a SiteGlide site if you would like to. But obviously you'll pay for a little bit extra on your monthly or annual costs for having multiple domains in SiteGlide, when actually if all you're doing is redirecting, there's no real need to. It's a little bit overkill. You could just do that in the registrar. Ursh asked, if we have 2 host domains, how do we forward one to the other? Using the fully delegated option. So again, I mean, you can add both if you'd like to SiteGlide, and then you can ask our team to forward one to the other. We can do that manually in the background, but realistically, there's no real need to. We would recommend adding your core domain and forwarding in the registrar. It keeps it nice and clean and simple. You have full control, and you're not paying extra for no reason. Ash also asks how to manage the difficulties around external domain management, including HTTPS redirects. So we looked at that earlier on domain forwarding, and we looked at, so GoDaddy offer HTTP and HTTPS for the forwarding. Not all registrars do offer the secure forwarding. Some of the older ones don't. And so what we'd recommend is just shifting registrars. Basically, if your client is determined to manage it externally, switch to a larger service. So either GoDaddy, you could do Cloudflare. is another one, or DNS Made Easy is another one. So these are all big global companies. So yeah, sure, they may not be local to you. I think actually we're in Australia, but their support teams are very large and they're there to help, and they do offer services like this. Next from Hartmut, so larger corporations generally don't allow delegation of DNS management to another company, but need the SSL certificate and forwarding. How can this be achieved? I think we covered this in the external DNS approach earlier, so do have a watch through that and any docs linked with this training session afterwards. That should cover everything you need in terms of looking after those larger companies. And Ash also asked any resources or support around providing confidence for those who don't know about SiteGlide to allow full domain delegation. So again, I think we've probably covered quite a lot earlier on that fully delegated approach, but I do appreciate, so some clients, they might not have heard of SiteGlide. They might be going, well, why am I moving my DNS to somebody I've not heard of or a new company? But it's not actually, you're not hosting the domain with SiteGlide, I would say. They're adding the domain to Amazon. It's AWS, which is one of the biggest providers on the planet. So it's not an unknown. They're adding it to Amazon for good reasons so that they can have their site live. So that's the other thing I would say. Okay, so that's everything. So I think what I'll do is open the floor up to anybody live. Do any of you have any questions? Or fantastic. All right, well, thank you all. Take care, and we will see you next time. Cheers.